For tonight's Green Report, we head to Australia, where earlier today, Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott, a well-known climate denier, was ousted in a surprise vote. His replacement is Malcolm Turnbull, also a Conservative, but one who recognizes the reality of global warming. Turnbull hasn't said whether he'll make any changes to the Abbott government's climate policy, but let's hope he does, because under Abbott's leadership, Australia, which has the second highest per capita carbon emissions among the G20 nations, moved backwards on climate policy. Last summer, for example, it did away with a 2-year-old carbon tax, becoming the first country in the developed world to do so. If new Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is serious about fighting climate change, like he said he is in the past, he'll need to put Australia's carbon tax back into place and then some. And that's because new evidence suggests that the risk of doing nothing to stop global warming is a whole lot more dangerous than we once thought. Joining me now to help explain why is Dr. Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Meteorology and Director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. Dr. Mann is also the author of a number of books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, which has just been released in a brand new second edition. Dr. Mann, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. It's always good to be with you.
It's great to have you with us. In a recent piece for EcoWatch, you talk about the risks of climate change and how the risk of a worst-case scenario is so much greater than we would expect in regards to a normal, in quotes, dangerous scenario. Talk about that. Why is that the case?
Sure. You know, we're used to thinking of things in terms of the bell curve. We all remember the bell curve from our, college days, the way exam scores were distributed. Sometimes it's called a normal distribution. It's a bell-like distribution. It describes most, probability distributions where most of the likelihood is in the middle. But as you get farther and farther away from the middle estimate, the central estimate, the likelihood tails off very quickly. Now, when it comes to matters like climate change, it turns out that if you look at the distribution, if you look at the likelihood of how much warming we will get if we double CO2 concentrations, well, we can't give you a precise number because there are some uncertainties. There's a range of somewhere we think most likely between about 2 degrees and 4.5 degrees Celsius. Now, it turns out that the probability as you go to higher and higher temperatures, 6, 7, 8, 9, doesn't drop off quickly like a bell curve. It drops off slowly. It has what we call a heavy tail. And that means that there is a significant likelihood of an amount of warming and associated changes in climate, increases in sea level, worsening of drought patterns, increased intensity of hurricanes. There is a sizable probability that things will actually be considerably worse than the models currently estimate. And because of that, it turns out that there is, again, a heavy tail of risk. There is a possibility of things being a lot worse than our best estimates suggest they might be, and we have to take that into account when we assess the risk of not acting to do something about the problem.
Does that tail in that graph entail, no pun intended, just the consequences or also the time frame of the consequences? In other words, does it also suggest that the planet will not recover as quickly as it slid into whatever kind of problems it's facing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It turns out when you talk about risk, the risk is the distribution of bad things that could happen if we don't act on a problem. A good example is fire insurance. We take fire insurance on our homes even though there's less than a 25% chance that any of us will ever have to deal with a house fire. But we understand that if it were to happen, it would be so disastrous that it is worth investing money to hedge against that outcome right now by purchasing fire insurance. And by acting on climate change, what we're doing is we're purchasing a planetary fire insurance policy. Now, if you look at the risk, it turns out risk is actually a product of two different things. It's a product of the probability of various outcomes times the consequence of those outcomes. And as we know, with climate change, the consequences become greater and greater. The potential dangers become much worse as we start to talk about larger and larger amounts of warming. And on your show, you've talked quite a bit about some of the so-called tipping points that we might face, the melting of the ice sheets, the release of vast amounts of methane from the permafrost if we warm the planet enough. Because of these potential responses, it turns out that the consequences get much worse as we start talking about larger and larger amounts of warming. So you take that probability, which is already pretty sizable, that warming much more than we estimate currently with the models will happen, you take that, multiply it by the probability that things with really bad consequences will happen as a result of that, and it turns out that the risk is huge. The risk of really bad things happening is huge, and that's why it makes sense to purchase, again, a planetary insurance policy, and that's acting on climate change. That's reducing our carbon emissions. That's transitioning to renewable energy and other sources of energy so that we don't risk some of these potentially extremely dangerous and potentially reversible impacts.
So those are the principal policy suggestions, I guess, or the broad brush of them. What kind of time frames are we looking at? I've heard some people say, we need to stop emitting carbon within, 1 year. Or we're going to see at least a 2-degree, increase, which could be disastrous. James Hansen has spoken out about this. And then there are others who say, we got a decade, we got 2 decades. You had a piece in Scientific American. We talked about it on this program a while back. I think you were talking about 2036, as I recall. What is your thinking on that right now?
Yeah, well, again, there is a range of views about climate change, and you invariably encounter people who say, well, it won't be that bad. And many of them, in fact, are, in one way or another, advocating for fossil fuel interests. And so you have to take into account, their perspective, where it's coming from. But there are scientists who do weigh in at the lower end, who honestly think that the warming will be less than most scientists think. And there are, of course, scientists who think it will be more than sort of our current sort of consensus estimate. And James Hansen would be a good example of someone who is articulating the case that the changes could be far worse than the models currently predict.
Right.
The fact is that if we want to avoid, so if we take 2 degrees Celsius, that's 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming relative to pre-industrial time, what many who have studied the impacts of climate change have defined as dangerous and potentially irreversible climate change, something we absolutely want to avoid, the red zone, that 2 degrees Celsius or more. If we decide that we need to avoid warming the planet more than that amount and all the things that will happen because of that, well, it turns out that we have to act quite quickly. We've already expended more than half of our so-called carbon budget. We've already burned well over 50% of the carbon we need to burn to ensure that we warm at least that much. And of course, because the warming, the emissions rather, have been increasing over time, we're expending that budget faster and faster. So the bottom line is, if you work out the math, we have to get our emissions down well below where they were even 2 decades ago within the next decade or two if we are going to avoid warming the planet more than that dangerous 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And many, those of us who are looking at that target and looking at what's necessary to avoid warming more than that target are looking closely at Paris later this year. The U.S. summit in Paris may be our last opportunity for a meaningful agreement among all of the emitters of the planet, an agreement that has enough teeth in it to make sure that we don't warm the planet more than that amount.
In the half a minute or so we have left, I'm curious your thoughts on this El Nino. Everybody's talking about this giant El Nino coming. To what extent is that reflecting climate change? To what extent is that going to exacerbate it? This is this warm water coming across the Pacific. It's going to hit California.
Well, El Nino, we can think of El Ninos and La Ninas. They come and go. They're like a tide. and they're on a tide that's on a rising sea level, if you like. The analogy is quite good. And so as the planet is warming more and more, but you have these El Niños that are occurring on top of that warming, and each time they happen, and it's happening right now, we reach a threshold that we've never seen before.
Yeah, so
you take one of those oscillations, you put it on an increasing baseline, and you see record warmth, and you see record changes in rainfall and drought and massive reorganization.
And that's coming now, right? I'm sorry we're out of time, but this is something to pay careful attention. Dr. Michael Mann, it is always a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much, sir.
Same here. Thanks.